overview. And she's here to talk about the meaning of Ahimsa, thank you. She wrote it down for me as well. And its relevance to yoga and veganism. And I'm a vegan and I'm really interested to hear what you have to say as well. So, welcome to Penang.
Who remembers the first time they came across yoga? I was about 21 and I was living in a squat in Notting Hill Gate at the time. And that was well before Notting Hill Gate was this sort of like trendy, sort of like rich, affluent area. It was kind of like quite scuzzy. Scuzzy to the effect that the room that I moved into in the squat had been used as a kitty litter room, so it was full of kitty poo. So moving in, I had to remove this carpet with kitty poo. However, I was very happy there. And I had this friend at the time who was Brazilian. She was an aromatherapist, which is like a very advanced when I was 21. Like hardly anybody had heard of aromatherapy. She came over one day and she's like, I've got something to tell you about. I'm like, okay, what? And she said, there's this thing that you can do, this exercise. If you do it, you're never going to get old. Oh, signed up. So she showed me this series of sort of like movements, and that was sun salutations. That was my introduction to yoga, and clearly something stuck because I've been doing yoga on and off ever since then. And I've done, I've done so many different styles. I'm not a teacher, by the way. I'm not a sort of like a yoga teacher. I'm just a practitioner. So I've done loads of different styles in sort of like, community halls and, I've done the yin yoga. Anyway, my yoga journey has encompassed all different sorts of styles, and many, many decades. But one thing that it never included until about 6 years ago was being vegan. Because for most of the time that I was doing yoga, I was absolutely not vegan. It didn't even cross my mind to be vegan. It didn't even cross my mind that it was an issue at all. I was just happily doing whatever style of yoga that I was into at the time, and would be like, that's it. The yoga for me was ending on the mat. And I think this is how it is for a lot of us who are doing yoga nowadays. Because yoga, the way it's presented to us as Western people, is very much, you can sort of have this pick and mix approach to it. You can do yoga with babies, you can do hot yoga, you can do yoga with crystals. One of the teachers here was doing a hard house or deep house yoga, which I would have actually loved to have gone along to. But the notion is that you can have all these sort of like different pick and mix approaches to yoga, and that it's just about the physical asanas. It's not any more than that. And of course that is fundamentally different from the reality of what yoga is, because fundamentally it's a spiritual development system. Okay? And somebody who speaks really well about this is BKS Iyengar. He's got this fantastic thing he says, which is that yoga is a subject with a well-defined philosophy, grammar, and goals. And it epitomises Indian spirituality. Do we all know who BKS Iyengar is? Yeah. So he's the person that founded Iyengar Yoga and passed away recently, about 4 or 5 years ago. So he's written a book called The Core of the Yoga Sutras, where it goes into the spiritual side of things. And I've been looking at this book and looking at other sort of like sacred texts recently, Hindu texts. And it's quite amazing to find out how systematic the yoga approach to living a good life is. I mean, I've personally been shocked by it, as I've been doing yoga for decades. But when you start to look into it, it's like, oh my God, it's an actual system for making a difference in your life. And it's fundamentally not meant to just be on the mat. Now, has anybody heard of Patanjali? Patanjali. Right, so the authority, yoga was first written about 2,600 years ago with the Upanishads. So that's how long it's been going. And one of the writers, all that time ago, the authority, is Patanjali, the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. So Patanjali says, by gaining experiential knowledge through yoga, the aspirant must use this wisdom in daily life, in day-to-day activities, as well as sharing with his fellow beings. And this word beings comes up a lot of time. This is all translated from the Sanskrit. The Gita says, people who are on the path of wisdom are immersed in the well-being of all beings. So the way that the yoga teachers in those days were thinking was not about people and animals. They were talking about the well-being of all beings. So it was a bit like the Buddhists had this notion of sort of like loving kindness, which is supposed to be going out to all beings. And this is how the yoga teachers and the sages in the past used to see yoga. It was very much applying to all beings. They said the sage sees with an equal eye the learned and humble Brahmin, a cow, an elephant, a dog, and an outcast. These different levels, this is a very key point. These were the different levels in Indian society in those days. The Brahmin, which is the priest caste, a cow, which is a sacred animal, an elephant, which is quite a sort of like revered animal, a dog, which is an animal which is not liked at all, and an outcast, which in Indian society in those days was a human being who was from the castes that were basically considered as not human. So basically, what they're saying in this quote is that everybody, all beings, should be seen in the same way. They're all equal. Now, more than that, a key part of yoga that we really don't hear about was the word that our friend who did the introduction was stumbling over, ahimsa. So, who has heard of ahimsa? Brilliant, fantastic. So, ahimsa, which is one of the core tenets of yoga, means non-violence. There's a lot more to it than that, but fundamentally what it means is non-violence. And in the yoga system that was being written about 2,600 years ago and ongoingly, ahimsa was non-violence to all beings, and it was the first, they had these things called like yama, which were like the Ten Commandments, only how the Hindus could live sort of like a happy, harmonious life as a society. And ahimsa was the first yama. So you've got these things like the Ten Commandments, which is like, you know, do this and live a happy and harmonious life. And ahimsa was the first one. So that shows you how seriously this notion of non-violence was seen. Now, another quote about ahimsa is that ahimsa is important because it makes, the effect of ahimsa is to make those who hate each other become friends. Those who hate each other become friends, which I think we need more than ever in this society, in this day and age. It's talking about being consistent. But remember, ahimsa also applies to the animals. It's not just, it's to all living beings. And the Hindu scriptures believe that animals, non-human beings, all had a soul, the Atman. They called it the Atman. So these are all kind of really important reasons to think about our yoga practice and what it actually means. Now, as I said, for decades when I was doing yoga, I didn't really think about any of this at all. But what happened that changed all of this is that I was introduced to veganism by a yoga teacher in Penang, in Malaysia. Her name is Suzanne. We were meeting for lunch one day over, it was the Nanda Bhavan, and it was like dosas. She said, I've got something to tell you. I'm like, what? She said, I'm vegan. So she said, I've got plant-based. And the husband said, vegan, like that, because he's northern and very sort of like stern. And she was sharing how she'd gone plant-based, basically for health reasons. So she wanted something to lose a bit of weight. So she said, just sort of like off the cuff, well, you should too. So I think I was vegetarian at the time, as maybe some people here are. And I thought, okay, I'll just do a bit of research. I went onto Facebook, and I was kind of like gobsmacked, really, by what I started to see, you know, from the average person's sort of like perspective. Suddenly, I'm seeing images, film images of a farmer stuffing his hand into a cow's rectum. And this is part of the sort of like the industry standard procedure. So then they can shove the artificial insemination thing up her vagina. This is industry standard. Because one of the things that I didn't realise then as a vegetarian, drinking my sort of like, you know, healthy milk and my healthy yogurt and my tasty cheese, was that why do cows produce milk? Well, if you've ever done any vegan outreach, you will be surprised that people like myself, a lot of people like myself, had no idea that cows have to be pregnant to produce milk. I'd never thought about it. So suddenly I'm seeing these sort of like images of sort of like people shoving their arms into cow rectums, and as I said, it's totally industry standard, of baby calves being sort of like separated from the mums, and the mum calves and the mums crying. You know, then I'm seeing sort of images of eggs. You see eggs, you just think that's just an egg, isn't it? There's no problem with an egg. And then suddenly you're seeing this massive conveyor belt with people sort of like separating the male and the female, sort of like chicks. That one day they're yellow and they're cheeping like this. And the males are carried on the conveyor belt. Has anybody seen these videos? And where are they going? Are they going to the happy male chick retirement home where they'll frolic in the grass and play in the sun?
Grinders, aren't they?
The grinders, they're going to be macerated alive. So one moment they're sort of like happy fluffy chickens, the next minute they're coming out as a bloody gooey mess. So I saw this, the cows, those are the fundamental things that changed me from being like non-vegan to vegan. And I very viscerally got the whole kind of violence side of things. And then, as I continued to do my sort of like yoga classes, as a vegan, then you start to want to sort of like maybe talk to people about, you know, the whole sort of vegan-y thing. And the second set of classes I was going to, we'd do our yoga and then we'd have a lunch. And the lunch tended to be some sort of like plant-based meal. And it seemed like a really good opportunity to talk about eating, you know, what people were eating, were they vegan or are they not vegan. So what I found when I did those talks, I don't know if anybody here has tried to have the sort of the vegan talk with other yoga practitioners, was really not a lot of interest. Really not a lot of interest. It's like we leave our yoga on the mat. You know, that's how it is. And it was increasingly frustrating to me. And I think it comes from this sort of like this pick and mix approach to yoga that we can have, as I said, the yoga with all different kinds of yoga, and we don't need to think about the spiritual side of things. I said when I started yoga, and for most of my yoga life, I wasn't really thinking of anything other than the positions and asanas on the mat. And that was fine, I enjoyed it, and that was really good. And that is what the Western culture tells us that yoga is all about. You know, that and sort of like, you know, buying nice little outfits and buying expensive mats and buying those little beanie bags that you can put over your eyes, and it's all that sort of like amazing stuff. Or maybe going on quite expensive holidays to do yoga in sort of like sunny places. But it doesn't really encourage us to think about being congruent with the practice that we do and, you know, our lives outside the mat. So this is another quote from Patanjali. He says, by gaining experiential knowledge through yoga, the aspirant must use this wisdom in daily life, in day-to-day activities, as well as sharing with his fellow beings. But people struggle. We all know that people struggle to take this message on board, and it seems surprising. I've talked to Buddhist people as well. Anybody that's got any sort of like a spiritual bent still can struggle with the concept of being vegan, because it's challenging at a very fundamental level how we see ourselves as human beings. It's challenging the human supremacist notion that we as human animals are infinitely better than other animals, and therefore we can do whatever we want to do with them. And that's why people, even if they've got a quasi-spiritual bent or a genuine spiritual bent, struggle with it. And again, B.K.S. Iyengar came out with this fantastic quote about this. He said, people have lost their sensitivity to be able to work intelligently with the body, which is the soul's support. And again, this is an Eastern concept that the body and the soul are absolutely intertwined, interconnected. Whereas in the Western culture, the way of thinking is that the soul, whatever you call it, or the spirit, is completely separate from the body. And really the body is kind of like down there and the soul is up there. It's definitely separate in the Western culture. Whereas, as I said, in the Eastern culture, as probably a lot of you know, the soul is seen, in B.K. Iyengar's words, the body is seen as the soul's support. He carries on. Sensual enjoyment and pleasures have become the fashion. I think we can all sort of like identify with that. In place of the true culture of physical, mental, and moral harmony. And I think it's interesting to reflect on these kind of things in terms of what we're trying to achieve with our yoga. And when I was doing yoga before I became vegan, I would tend to refer to it as a moving meditation. But I don't know what I really thought I was doing. Having a moving meditation, which is all about peace and love and namaste and stuff like that, and torturing innocent animals to death, which is what I was doing for most of my yoga life. As I said, until about 7 years ago, I was a serial animal abuser and murderer, like most people who practice. Where are we in terms of walking the yoga talk? Where are we really walking the yoga talk? No, we're not. We're just leaving the yoga behind on the mats, which is not how it was designed to be. And we're missing out on a fantastic opportunity there of self-reflection, self-progression, and actually healing the societies that we live in, which are broken beyond words. The societies including the animals as well as the human beings. Everyone. So this was epitomised, this split was epitomised. So I've been doing Ashtanga yoga for a while now, and about 5 or 6 years. And what I found was that you have because it's like mainly a sort of like a self-practice thing, I went on Facebook and there'd be sort of like discussion groups about Ashtanga. And often, because it's seen as quite a sort of like a rigorous style, people talk about diet and food and what you should be eating. And, people talk about, protein and meat. Some people pipe up and say it's about vegetarian is fine, I'm vegetarian. And then I would contribute, generally sort of saying, when I was vegan, vegan, we should all be vegan, shouldn't we? And Ahimsa, walking the talk, non-violence. And I'll never forget what happened. There was a response to this that I still find shocking to this day. Some woman responded, and she said, "But what about the violence to yourself?" She was equating being vegan, not torturing animals to death, with some presumed violence to oneself. Which any of us who are vegan here, it's still sort of like jaw-dropping, but it was obviously a sincere comment. So I think in order to understand, and probably there's a lot of people on the mats, not necessarily in this room, but perhaps we all know people outside this room, who perhaps could benefit from a little bit of an understanding about violence. So violence is, as I was saying, you've got the farmer sticking his arm into the cow's rectum. That's violence. Having the cow, because after the first couple of times that this has happened to a cow, they'll try and escape. So they're held in something that is called a rape rack, as some of us obviously know. Violence is when the mother pig is held in a gestation crate. You can't turn around. And you can see when you look at the videos that, their eyes, they're in hell, they've gone mad. They've got the intelligence of a 3-year-old child. And they are just dying inside. Violence is when, as I said, you see the baby chickens being ground up alive. And I think we should be happy, not happy, but feel free as vegans to talk about this. To the other practitioners on the mat, outside of our own sort of like little vegan circle. Sometimes it can be difficult. Yes, of course it can be difficult. But we owe it to the animals. Let's look at the violence that happens with fishing, with these great big trawlers, the factory ships that basically destroy the fish in the oceans. And for every £1 of animal flesh, marine animal flesh that is consumed, £5 is thrown out back into the ocean, dead and dying as bykill. Let's look at the violence of the climate change implications of animal agriculture. Because animal agriculture, the animal death industry, is the biggest contributor to catastrophic climate change. That's violence. You know, with temperatures going up to 50 degrees Celsius in places like India and Pakistan, you know, with floods, we all, you know, this is happening now. This has been happening for years. This is the violence that we need to be thinking about, that we don't want to be part of as vegans and as people who are vegan who are talking to their friends who are not vegan. I'm not saying it's easy, but it's really important. What about the violence that is the species extinction that is caused by animal agriculture? 70% of biodiversity loss is caused by animal agriculture, the animal death industry. Let's be clear about what's going on in our planet. Now, as conscious people, we're doing yoga, so perhaps we might assume that we're a bit more conscious than the average person in the street. We would hope we are. You know, and there's always room for anybody to grow and learn more. But these are the sort of issues I think that we need to be sort of bringing, not that we need to think about them on the mat, but when we're doing our asanas and when we're doing our meditation, we need to really integrate who we want to be with the spiritual progression that yoga is all about. Yoga is like a ladder. Yoga is a system. As I said, B.K. Iyengar was saying that yoga is a philosophy with its own grammar and its goals. And by walking the talk, we can make an impact not just on ourselves, but on society. Now, we may not want to do this, or we may, but I'm hoping that by just exposing this subject, we can all perhaps feel a little bit more empowered to go and have those conversations that otherwise we might not, because it is difficult, you know. And if people here are not vegan, maybe they would like to have a think about the choice that we have to be, as I used to be, a serial animal abuser and murderer, and being a vegan. I mean, it really is that simple. And people talk. Gandhi had this great quote, which was, "Be the change that you want to see." And being the change that we as vegans want to see, doesn't just mean being vegan. It means speaking out. It means taking action. That's what Gandhi was all about. Gandhi was basically practiced karma yoga. So that's being active in the world. He wasn't sort of like into asanas, but he was into the whole sort of like, you know, changing his whole sort of like inner being and spirituality. It was amazing what he did. You know, went celibate, although he was married, you know, he was constantly working on himself. This is what the person that is into yoga has the opportunity to do. It's an opportunity. It's a gift that we all have. So that's kind of where I am in terms of sort of like sharing this with you. Somebody's flagging up noises. You know, that we want to be the change that we want to see, and that may mean speaking out in a way that doesn't feel perhaps comfortable or natural. So I'm representing a group called Animal Justice Emergency today. It's a local Bristol group, and we do sort of like animal activism. We're interested in sort of like talking about reframing the conversation so that veganism is not seen as just what you eat. It's seen as a moral choice. I mean, I've already had a few conversations outside, with non-vegans who are sort of like, yeah, it's so difficult, you know, diet, sort of like when you go outside. And I'm like, it's an ethical, moral decision. So that is kind of one of the things that we do. But also, since it's a new group, people can sort of like come along and, you know, if they want to say, get involved in a bit of design work or give talks or what their particular thing is, you know, we welcome that. We have regular meetings, weekly meetings, once a week. I'm currently in Hawke Market. So that's us, Animal Justice Emergency, trying to sort of like make a plea for walking the Ahimsa talk off the mat. And that's really, I'm happy to take questions, but thank you for your attention today.